And thank you for a really fantastic presentation that you made. And I agree. I'm the one who said that, so I accept the quote that you said. Your Excellency, Ambassador Joseph Osako, my dear sister, Commissioner of Agriculture, Rural Development, and Blue Economy of the African Union Commission. Your Excellency, Kobina Adjamani, the Minister of Agriculture for Côte d'Ivoire. Your Excellency, Jimmy Cooper, the Minister of Agriculture for Liberia. Honorable Minister of Ethiopia, I understand he'll be joining us virtually. The Principal Secretary of Agriculture for Kenya, Mr. Kintani. Dr. Marco Ferroni, the Chairperson of the OneCGIAR System Management Board. Dr. Claudio Sadoff, it's nice to see you, Managing Director for Research Delivery and Impact of the OneCGIAR. My dear friends and brothers and of the Director Generals of the CGIAR system, it's nice to see all of you here today. The Executive Secretary of FARA, Yemi Akinbamija, the Executive Directors of the sub-regional research organizations, friends and partners of the CGIAR, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. Good morning to everyone. I wish to thank you all for accepting to attend this meeting in Abidjan. The attendance of their excellencies and ministers of agriculture and the African Union's Commissioner for Agriculture, Rural Development, and of course, Blue Economy, Her Excellency Joseph Osako, shows how important this meeting is for Africa. I wish to thank the senior management team of the OneCGIAR, the Director Generals of the CGIAR centers, the Executive Secretary of FARA, and heads of all the sub-regional agricultural research centers for really being here collectively at this meeting, following our first virtual meeting held in Abidjan, or let me say, from Abidjan. I would like to thank all the partners of the CGIAR for being here. I know others may be connected virtually, and I'd like to in particular acknowledge the World Bank and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for their tremendous support to the CGIAR. I wish to thank the OneCGIAR for all the hard work and great efforts and reflections that have gone into the reforms that have been done on the CGIAR. I know reforms are necessary. I run them every single day since I've been president of the bank, and I know there are tough things to do. So I empathize. And I know that the goal is to try to improve coordination so that you can have greater efficiency, so you can have greater effectiveness, and also, of course, to ensure that we have greater delivery of impacts for the CGIAR. Our meeting today is critical, as the OneCGIAR reforms are at critical junctures as far as Africa is concerned. You will recall that I had expressed some concerns in December of 2021 about the ongoing CGIAR reforms. My position then and now remain the same. That the OneCGIAR is not sufficiently supporting, engaging, and prioritizing the needs and the concerns of Africa. In my view, this needs to be corrected and corrected urgently. I come to this discussion wearing several hats. The first, as an agricultural economist, with close to 35 years of experience in international agriculture, including myself 10 years as a senior scientist in 3 different CGIAR centers, ICRISAT, WADA we used to call it, now it's the Africa Rice Center, and of course at IITA. Second, as a former Minister of Agriculture of Nigeria, Africa's largest country, who led an agricultural transformation work that got technologies to over 15 million farmers within 4 years. Third, as a World Food Prize winner. And finally, as president of the African Development Bank, an institution that is implementing investments of up to $25 billion in agriculture in Africa. So you can see that I am a thoroughbred agricultural leader and expert who has spent all of my life and career to help Africa to feed itself. That is why I want the best for Africa. My experiences have shown me that the CGIAR is central to any efforts for developing countries to achieve agricultural growth and food security. The work of the CGIAR centers in Africa are critical for achieving food security on the continent. When I was elected president of the African Development Bank in 2015, the first ever agricultural expert to be a president of a multilateral development bank, I decided to use my position, my voice, and my experience to position Africa to feed itself. The bank launched its Feed Africa strategy with the goal of reaching farmers with agricultural technologies and achieving zero hunger by 2025. I know it's a very, very tough call, but we are actually in a race against time. The bank launched a 10-year, $25 billion investment program to support agricultural transformation and food security. Abu Saba was then my vice president at the bank. And I really want to thank you for what you did then, and thank you for the exceptional work you're doing now as Director General of ICADA. I recognized with my team that CGIAR was critical for our success. Now, what many of you may not know was that I actually helped to save the CGIAR from being phased out in 2015 by the World Bank. I will tell you today so that you can understand why I am particularly concerned about some of the elements of the approach being taken by the CGIAR reforms and Africa. I will share with you because I want you to know why business as usual approach by the CGIAR will never be supported in Africa. I will tell you so that you know that indeed, despite my critics or criticisms, I'm actually your biggest supporter. For when I say I was not happy with ongoing reforms, I want you to understand where I'm coming from. Following my election as president of the African Development Bank, I met for the first time the then president of the World Bank, Dr. Jim Kim, in New York in September of 2015 at the United Nations General Assembly. I told him of my vision for Africa to feed itself, and that to do this, the African Development Bank will be launching a Feed Africa strategy, and that the African Development Bank plans to invest $25 billion in agriculture over a 10-year period to help Africa to feed itself. President Jim Kim told me how the World Bank had been financing for a long time the work of the CGIAR for decades. Of course, I will know that. I haven't been myself a senior scientist in the system for a decade. And that he was not seeing many impacts and wanted to phase out the World Bank support and redirect the funds to other critical areas, such as health and education. Of course, being an agricultural person, I urge him very strongly that he should not, and that this will jeopardize the planned Feed Africa strategy of the African Development Bank. That it couldn't be that just when we want to feed Africa, then the plug is pulled off or the rug is pulled away more than our feet. I told him, and he smiled, that in a very gentle way, that if he did that, I would scream so loud you won't like it. But I told him that we cannot succeed if there is no CGIAR to support the vision and deliver the technologies. That tells you my confidence in the place that I work for a decade. I assured him, though, that I will do all I can to ensure that the CGIAR is held accountable for results for food security. President Jim Kim listened attentively to me, and he then looked at me and agreed to shelve such plans to phase out the CGIAR financial support and said the now famous words to me, "Okay, Akin, if you can get them to deliver, you lead and we will follow," end of quote. This was what led me to call for the meeting of all the Director Generals of the CGIAR in Dakar in October of 2015, where the African Development Bank launched its Feed Africa strategy, and Abu Sabah was with me there. The then coordinator of the CGIAR Secretariat in Washington said, "We will deliver to you." I told the DGs of the CGIAR there that were there to give me a plan on how we will feed Africa. I remember the coordinator of the CGIAR Secretariat then at the World Bank said, "We will deliver this to you in 6 months." I said, "Really? For all these decades of support to the CGIAR, you can only give me a plan in 6 months on how we're going to feed Africa?" Of course, I demanded firmly that if this was the case, I will have no qualms at all in calling the president of the World Bank and telling him to shut down the CGIAR. I said, if you don't give me the plan on how we are going to feed Africa by 6 a.m. the following day, I will call the president of the World Bank and ask him to shut down the CGIAR. The Director Generals, and they are here, worked overnight and through the next day, and this was what led to the creation of the development of what is called TAT, Technologies for African Agricultural Transformation, with strong commitments to get technologies to scale of millions of farmers for several commodities. Hence, the TAT's Technology Delivery Compacts, which were signed with participating CGIAR centers. We saved the CGIAR. And the development of TAT secured the future of the CGIAR. The focus was simple: get technologies to farmers at scale and be accountable for impact. If there's anybody that has influenced me the most in my career, it is the late Dr. Norman Borlaug, the Nobel Prize winner for his tremendous work and the father of the Green Revolution. I remember one day we were working in New York. This was in 2006, before the Abuja Fertilizer Summit. He and I were crossing the street on the way to Rockefeller Foundation. He tapped me on the shoulders and asked me a question. He said, "Akin, do you play football?" And I said, "No, sir, I do not play football," because I thought he was talking about the American football. Of course, with my scraggy looking nature, there's no way I was going to do that. I said, "But I play soccer." And he tapped me again on my shoulders and he said, "Akin, work as hard as you can for Africa to score its first goal on agriculture. In soccer, if you score your first goal, then you know you can actually win the game." I never forgot that. It meant we had to score goals for agriculture fast, because Africa cannot lose on food security. TAT is also revolutionary in that, as opposed to the old systems where technologies were tested several years in multiple locations before being released, technologies now tested in similar agroecological bands will be released in countries sharing the same agroecological zones. That is revolutionary. It will allow for rapid release of technologies. Dr. Tenkwano's brilliant presentation that talks about pests and diseases. The pests and diseases don't take visas. They don't go to embassies and ask for permission to move. Agroecological zones break down the walls and go horizontal. It's the way it is. If something is produced in one location, it must be able to apply all across. And that will give you economies of scale and scope in technology delivery at scale. Our Feed Africa work at the African Development Bank has already benefited over 76 million farmers with access to improved agricultural technologies. Since we launched TAT, and let me give great credit to all the Director Generals here, to my team, Dr. Martin Fregene, for exceptional leadership, Africa has been achieving incredible success. Let me share some examples. TAT has delivered climate smart seeds to 12 million farmers in 27 countries in just 2 years. TAT delivered water-efficient maize to 5 million households in East Africa, an area hit by severe droughts 3 years ago. The drought was severe, but farmers secured their food supply with the water-efficient maize varieties. And here, I must give credit again. I was then an associate director of the Rockefeller Foundation based in Harare, Zimbabwe, in charge of Southern Africa region, when a young, dynamic, and brilliant scientist from Switzerland walked into my office, and her name was Dr. Marian Banzinger. Dr. Banzinger was a phenomenal plant breeder. And there was another guy, I remember his name was Kevin Pixton, who used to be the head of CIMET based in Harare, Zimbabwe. Banzinger told me, we can actually develop water-efficient maize for Africa. I believed her. I actually provided the financing for her, that institution, to go develop the water-efficient maize varieties that I just mentioned to you. When she developed those varieties, we now had to make sure whether these varieties could work. At the time, Howard Buffett, Warren Buffett's son, had a farm in South Africa. And Howard told me, Akin, bring in these water-efficient maize varieties that have been developed. And let us take it to the Limpopo area in South Africa, which is very close to Zimbabwe. Those of you that know it, it's very, very hot and dry. He told me if it works there, if it survives there, it will survive anywhere. Those varieties survive. And so when the droughts hit in 2018, 2019, Permanent Secretary, in your area, we went back to these same varieties. That just tells you the importance of CG centers in Africa doing relevant work that is helping us today. In Sudan, TAT financed the provision of 65,000 metric tons of heat-tolerant varieties. And just for context, of course, that is about the equivalent of 665 A380 Airbuses. That is the biggest Airbuses planes you can have. So you can imagine 665 of those on a landing strip. The farmers cultivated it very, very quickly in Sudan. They grew 317,000 hectares. And in just 2 years, Sudan reduced its wheat imports by 50%. We did the same in Ethiopia. TAT financed the provision of 61,000 metric tons of seed of heat-tolerant wheat varieties for farmers in Ethiopia. The farmers cultivated 5,000 hectares of these heat-tolerant varieties in 2018. They expanded it to 167,000 hectares 2 years later. And by this year, they had grown 400,000 hectares. I was so delighted to mention this to the Prime Minister of Ethiopia just last week when I was just getting an honorary doctorate from the University of Addis Ababa. We were having lunch. And I said it, the Prime Minister leaned forward, listening to me attentively. Oh, he let me finish, and then he said, and I quote, Akin, we've done better than that. Ethiopia's wheat production is now on 650,000 hectares. And I'm quoting him. We harvested 2.6 million metric tons of wheat. Ethiopia did not import wheat this year. Next year, we will cultivate 2 million hectares on the wheat. We expect to export at least 1.25 to 2 million hectares, metric tons of wheat to Kenya and Djibouti next year. End of quote. Simply incredible. TAT delivered Nerika rice varieties to 3.2 million households in just 2 years, and the Director General of the Africa Rice Center is here. They are friends of the CGIAR. These successes were possible because of the financial support of the African Development Bank and with the great support of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and other partners working in close collaboration with the CGIAR. With all humility, never in the history of the CGIAR have we seen this kinds of impact being witnessed at scale rapidly in Africa. TAT has helped to connect the research and development of the CGIAR with farmers, seed companies, agricultural value chains, and sources of finance as well as policy support that now delivers technologies to farmers at scales of millions in Africa, which we are now used to. As the CGIAR does its reforms, it needs to bear in mind that the focus in Africa is not more technologies, but getting technologies out of farmers at the scale of millions of farmers. Africa has no time again for tiny CGIAR projects. We must feed Africa, and there is no time to waste. There must therefore be accountability of the CGIAR to help achieve zero hunger in Africa. Research is important, but people do not eat research papers. We are just 8 years away from 2030, and Africa must achieve zero hunger by then. Thus, your reforms must hold you accountable to targets that Africa seeks to achieve. The days of the CGIAR doing what it pleases, where it pleases, and when it pleases are over in Africa. This is not the time for untested experiments with the CGIAR in Africa. This is not the time for theory. This is the time to build on and around what is working pragmatically. The OneCGIAR reforms in Africa should explicitly build around TART to take results to even greater scales and put in place a system for accountability for delivering technologies to millions of farmers using results-based financing. They are friends of the CGIAR. The CGIAR must also learn from failures of earlier approaches that have tried to use a programmatic approach instead of an institutional approach in Africa. Let me share lessons from 3 examples. Rice in Africa, sorghum in Africa, and maize in Africa. Let me start with rice. In the 1980s, and for decades, the approach of the CGIAR to address the lack of productivity in Africa and repeat the rice revolution witnessed in Asia was to have rice research programs centralized. Researchers will contribute their germplasm work to what was then called INGA Africa, or the International Genetic Resources for Africa. Research proposals will link researchers from international and global universities and research and development centers, as well as national agricultural research institutions, to develop and deploy germplasm of rice to Africa. There was even a recommendation to scrap the West Africa Rice Development Association, WADA, and let the International Rice Research Institute, IRI, based in Philippines, to take over the rice work for Africa. The approach failed, as rice varieties introduced or deployed were not adapted to Africa. The successes we have today on rice with the Nerica varieties came because there was an Africa-based and well-funded at the time, maybe I'll ask the DG how well it's funded today, West Africa Rice Development Association. I was then part of the team that developed the Nericas in the early 1990s. Today, we have great success with rice, with Nigeria witnessing a rapid rice revolution, which I started when I was Minister of Agriculture in Nigeria. Here is the lesson. Without a well-empowered CGIAR center in Africa on rice, Africa will not have achieved success it has today. Institutional approach succeeded. Programmatic approach failed. Let me shift to sorghum. Similarly, the approach for sorghum in Africa mirrored that of rice. sorghum technologies from India, where the International Crop Research Institute for the Semi-Arid Tropics, where I used to work, was to use a programmatic approach of connecting scientists via proposals to get sorghum technologies to Africa. Proposals were vetted, rated, and then people were given money to go get it done. The approach failed. As sorghum technologies developed, did not fit into Africa's environment. Success came when an institutional approach was taken. And ICRISAT set up centers in Africa. One in Niamey for the Sahel, one in Bamako, Mali. In fact, I worked there. It's called the West Africa Sorghum Improvement Program, used to be called WASE. And one in Southern Africa, based in Zimbabwe, for the semi-arid areas of Southern Africa. Here, friends, is the lesson. The successes achieved with sorghum technologies to date in Africa came from an institutional approach, with the centers on the ground, not from the centralized programmatic approach. Let me shift to maize. The success of maize in Africa came because of the institutional approach of the International Institute of Tropical Agriculture, IITA, whose Director General Sanginga is here, in the Guinea Savannah of West Africa. And of course, by CIMET, with its water-efficient maize developed on the ground by scientists based out of CIMET Research Center based in Harare, Zimbabwe. As I mentioned earlier to you, I actually helped to support the development of these water-efficient maize varieties while I was an associate director at the Rockefeller Foundation based in Harare, Zimbabwe. The CGIAR reforms will therefore learn and use an institutional approach based on strong on-the-ground and fully empowered centers, not a series of programs stitched together to be delivered around the CGIAR centers. In Africa, institutional approaches have been the success of the CGIAR. Programmatic approaches have failed. We need very strong CGIAR centers in Africa with director generals that can make decisions independently, reporting to a small but empowered and efficient board and accountable for driving agreed results for farmers. It has been said that history repeats itself when people do not learn the first time. The OneCGIAR reform has also introduced the centralization of leadership of the CGIAR outside of Africa. There are serious issues with the lack of diversity and absence of senior African leadership in the management committee of the CGIAR. The Africa-based CGIAR centers seem to have therefore been relegated to being subservient to decisions of a few based outside of Africa. This is not acceptable to Africa. The CGIAR reforms also does not have any plans institutionally to strengthen the national and regional agricultural research centers, such as the Forum for Agricultural Research in Africa, FARA, or any of the sub-regional agricultural research organizations. We're just listening to Tenkwano talking about that for us for Kora. As I reviewed all the programmatic proposals of the OneCGIAR, I actually sat up one morning. I was reading on my mobile phone, and I read every single one of them for more than 5 hours. So I know what I'm talking about. As I reviewed all these proposals of the OneCGIAR, one cannot but notice that national researchers are nothing more than individuals listed as collaborators on project proposals. There is no institutional framework to strengthen national and regional agricultural research centers. The issue of training of national agricultural research centers, researchers, and the research and development ecosystem for the success on the ground is completely missing. It may be time to bring back, at least in terms of thinking, the old ISNA, we used to call it, International Service for National Agricultural Research. Ever since ISNA was dissolved and moved to become a program within IFPRI, support for strengthening national agricultural research institutions in Africa all but disappeared. The CGIAR cannot succeed in Africa unless it creates an institutional framework for strengthening national and regional agricultural research centers. They are friends of the CGIAR. Furthermore, the OneCGIAR reforms needs to better reflect and represent the interests of African governments and their incredible role in hosting the Africa-based CGIAR centers. Within the framework of headquarters hosting agreements, which were approved by their parliaments. My own father-in-law, the late Dr. Barnabas Olorontope, who was the Federal Permanent Secretary of Agriculture in Nigeria, was the one who actually gave out the massive land that you see today in the 1970s for IITA. That's where the campus of IITA is based. He later served as the vice chair of the IITA Board of Trustees. For over 50 years, African governments have sacrificed for the CGIAR. They have provided land, facilities, fiscal incentives, with tax exemptions for staff salaries, equipment, and given away badly needed taxes, and providing diplomatic support for the work of the CGIAR centers. To come up with a reform that now seems to take control of these Africa-based CGIAR centers, but the OneCGIAR based in France or Rome goes contrary to the host country agreements and the spirit of strategic partnership that have given the CGIAR wide political support in Africa. Let me be very clear. The CGIAR is not doing Africa any favors. African governments must be seen as equal partners and stakeholders, or shareholders, let me rather say, of the CGIAR. Without the strong support of governments of the CGIAR for the CGIAR centers in Africa, the OneCGIAR will fail in Africa. So, my dear friends and colleagues, in closing, let me say that the African Development Bank calls for a review of the OneCGIAR reforms in the light of what I have said. The reforms must not weaken the CGIAR centers in Africa. The reforms should not minimize director generals and board decision-making structures on the ground that have worked so effectively. Of course, while some areas need to be optimized to lower administrative costs, reduce overheads, and improve coordination and efficiencies, reforms should not become deformed. The reforms should ensure that the CGIAR is held fully accountable for impacts in getting technologies to millions of farmers. The days of research for research's sake are over. The reforms should build around the highly successful TAT program in Africa to ensure accountability in the delivery of technologies to millions of farmers based on the impressive results that have been achieved by TAT on the ground in Africa. The reforms should be based on an institutional approach, not a programmatic approach that has been shown to have failed in the past. The reforms should focus on and strengthen decentralization and empowerment of the CGIAR, not a centralization of the CGIAR managed by a select few out of Africa. I can assure you that no African country will agree to turn over the control of its Africa-based CGIAR centers to any OneCGIAR leadership team outside of Africa. Finally, the reform should incorporate and strengthen partnership and ownership with the national and regional agricultural research centers, and specifically strengthen national and regional agricultural research institutions, such as FARA and the sub-regional research organizations. Let me repeat it again. Reforms must not become deforms. It is time that we recalibrate the OneCGIAR reforms in Africa to better take on board the full range of positions, priorities, and concerns of Africa. You will be sure, or you can be sure, that the African Development Bank and myself personally, we strongly support the recalibration to ensure that the interests of Africa are well taken on board and that the CGIAR centers take their proper role in helping to drive zero hunger in Africa. Thank you very much.